Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk about the problem of creation for a God. Many religious believers claim that God created the universe. But what does that actually mean? How can an eternal, changeless being perform an act of creation? Apologists like William Lane Craig have attempted to answer this question. However, the more I examine their responses, the more contradictions I see emerge. The very idea of creation seems to undermine God's supposed nature as an eternal, fully actualized being. In the end, attempts to explain creation make it look less like an act of divine will and more like an inevitability, something that, if God exists, he had no choice in at all. The way I understand it, William Lane Craig argues that the act of creation wasn't something that happened before the universe existed, but rather at the same time as the universe coming into being. He claims that just as a window breaking, the effect, happens at the same moment that the brick strikes it, the proximate cause, God's act of creation was simultaneous with the first moment of time. According to Craig, before creation, or without creation, to avoid temporal language, God existed timelessly. But when the universe came into being, God entered time at that very first moment. His existence became temporal alongside creation. Craig insists that this is the only way to make sense of causality, arguing that if cause and effect were not simultaneous, there would be a gap between them, and causation couldn't occur at all. But is his explanation coherent? Let's take a closer look. Classical theism holds that God is pure actuality, meaning he is fully realized, lacking all potentiality, and completely unchanging. But even if we grant that cause and effect can be simultaneous, causation still involves a difference between what would have been the case without the effect and what is the case with the effect. The difference between God alone by himself and God plus the universe is real according to Craig, meaning God transitions from one state, not having created and not being with his creation, to another, having created and being with his creation. That's a change, whether Craig acknowledges it or not, and if God changes, he cannot be purely actual, contradicting classical theism. As I understand it, Craig's argument relies on distinguishing between God's necessary existence and his contingent will. That is, there was no necessity for God to create. He could have willed otherwise. But this response only works if God's will is truly contingent. If God's will is fully actualized from eternity, then there was never a possibility of God not willing to create. That means the universe was never merely a possibility, it was an inevitability. In other words, the universe was never not going to exist. From God's perspective, the universe wasn't something that could have existed or might have existed. It necessarily exists. Craig wants to say that God freely chooses to create. But if God's choice exists eternally and necessarily, then in what sense is it really free? It's like saying, this being necessarily wills X, but X could have failed to happen. That's incoherent to me. If God's decision to create is part of his eternal actuality, then creation follows necessarily, not contingently. Craig insists that creation is not co-eternal with God because the universe has a beginning. But from God's eternal changeless perspective, there was never a moment when the universe was not known or not willed by him. That means creation is eternally present in God's mind. There was never an instant where God alone existed without creation being a fully actualized part of his knowledge and will. The analogy of an author conceiving of a novel fails in my mind because human authors change their minds and exist in time. If God is truly timeless, then his will to create is part of his eternal nature. That means the universe's existence is as eternal and necessary as God himself in this model. Saying the universe has a beginning is irrelevant to the real issue. If God is timeless, the universe has always been willed, meaning it has always existed from God's point of view. If God is fully actualized and unchanging, then every thought in his mind must also be fully actualized eternally. The thought of creation cannot be something God comes up with. That would imply a change. As I see it, Craig claims that God can have fully actualized thoughts about possibilities that do not exist. But that ignores the unique nature of God's mind in classical theism. If God is fully actual and changeless, then there is no distinction between thinking something and willing it to be the case. Unlike humans, whose thoughts are distinct from their actions, God's intellect and will are fully unified. If God has an eternal thought about creating, that thought must be fully realized, meaning creation must exist necessarily. From the very little I've read about atheist philosophers Graham Oppy and William Rowe, they have highlighted similar issues in arguments about divine simplicity and necessity. If God is a necessary being, and his will is unified with his existence, then whatever he wills must also be necessary. In my estimation, Craig tries to escape this by saying God freely chooses which thoughts to actualize, but that just ignores the problem. If that choice is eternal, then it is necessary. If it's not necessary, then God has potentiality, meaning he is not purely actual. Either way, Craig doesn't avoid the contradiction. Craig's defense of divine creation, as I understand it, ultimately fails. It doesn't explain how an unchanging God performs a creative act without introducing change into God. If God is timeless, then he cannot perform actions including creation. He undergoes change by going from a non-creator being to a creator being, so he isn't the changeless, purely actual being classical theism describes. Craig cannot distinguish between a necessary divine will and a contingent universe, and he cannot reconcile God's eternal, fully actualized thoughts with the supposed contingency of creation. The result? The very concept of divine creation collapses under its own contradictions. If God's thoughts are fully actualized eternally, then the thought of creation is fully actualized eternally. That means creation is not a choice, it simply is, as necessary as God himself. The very idea of God deciding to create collapses because there was never a point where creation wasn't already fully realized. Craig tries to defend a version of God that avoids both timeless causation and any change in God's nature, but to me his explanation fails on both counts. In the end, the idea of a timeless, changeless God creating the universe is incoherent. If we want a real explanation for why the universe exists, we need something that actually makes sense, not something that contradicts itself. What do you think? Does the idea of God creating the universe make sense, or does it collapse under its own contradictions? I readily admit that this is a dense topic, and I've probably missed certain things, perhaps even many things. Let me know in the comments below. I'm ready for it, and I look forward to reading your comments and changing my mind if needs be. Thank you. See you next time.